Connecticut Sun head coach, he spoke about Caitlin Clark, and then we're going to get into one. These are two realities, but she's not going to be treated like anyone else. She's not going to get fair treatment. You heard coach say, hey, she's one of the greatest in the world. It's not really too much you can do. We tried.
Easy lay-in. Easy lay-in.
You see all that trash talking? Nobody's jumping up and saying Olivia Miles. Nobody is saying that she's a negative person. But if this was Caitlin Clark doing this trash talking, and I got more for you, it would be a problem.
The conversation around fairness in women's basketball has reached a point where two players can do the exact same thing on the court and walk away with entirely different outcomes. One gets a technical foul, a week of media debate, and a lecture about maturity. The other gets a laugh from teammates and a label like authentic or passionate. More often than not, the player on the receiving end of the stricter standard is Caitlin Clark, and as the 2026 WNBA season has progressed, the gap between how she is treated and how everyone around her is treated has become harder to explain away as coincidence. It helps to start with why the scrutiny on Clark is so disproportionate in the first place. She is, by most measures, the single biggest driver of attention the league has ever had, filling arenas on the road as reliably as at home, and pulling in television audiences that dwarf the league's pre-2024 numbers. Road arenas that once drew modest crowds now sell out months in advance whenever the Fever schedule is announced, and television partners have restructured broadcast windows around her games. That commercial weight does not buy her any cushion. If anything, it has done the opposite, turning every foul, every gesture, and every post-game comment into a story large enough to dominate a news cycle, while the same behavior from a teammate or an opponent passes without comment. The bigger the platform, the smaller the margin for error, and nowhere has that shown up more clearly than in how the games themselves are officiated and discussed. Start with the physical level of play, because that is where the pattern shows up most plainly. When the Connecticut Sun met the Indiana Fever, the contact directed at Clark throughout the night was significant. She absorbed contact from Brittany Griner on at least two separate plays without a whistle, one of which sent her to the floor. Indiana still won the game 85-75, but the night ended with Clark picking up her fourth technical foul of the season, called for a gesture toward the Sun bench in the closing seconds. The image that circulated afterward was telling. Clark on the floor after an uncalled hit, and Clark in the box score for a technical minutes later. Commentator Jason Whitlock framed the entire sequence as a behavioral problem belonging to Clark herself, arguing that her history with officials was the reason calls were not going her way and that players get the energy they give. That argument treats years of physical contact as something Clark invited, rather than something the league's officiating crews simply chose not to whistle. That game was not isolated. A week earlier, in a loss to the New York Liberty, the disparity showed up in a far more direct form: free throw attempts. New York shot 41 free throws that night. Indiana shot 15. Breanna Stewart alone went to the line 21 times, 6 more than the entire Fever roster combined. Clark, picking up her fourth foul of that game as well, did not blame the officials afterward. She said plainly that she needed to do a better job getting to the free throw line herself, calling those points easy and admitting she had not earned many trips to the line that season. Stephanie White, asked about the same disparity, pointed to defensive positioning rather than the officiating crew. Both were careful not to say what a sizable portion of the fan base was already saying out loud, that the league's most watched guard was absorbing contact at a rate other stars are not, while drawing whistles at a rate other stars do not have to survive. The league's own numbers back up the sense that something has shifted this season, even if they do not settle the argument about who it is shifting against. Personal fouls climbed from roughly 32 a game in 2025 to nearly 42 a game early in 2026, a jump tied directly to a new officiating task force built to crack down on physical play and protect freedom of movement. That task force exists because of how ugly the conversation around physicality had become the year before, when Minnesota's Cheryl Reeve called a playoff officiating crew's tolerance for contact malpractice after Nafisa Collier was injured, and Las Vegas coach Becky Hammon warned that the level of physicality allowed on the floor was out of control and would eventually cause a fight. The league responded by tightening enforcement, and technical fouls climbed right along with personal fouls. By mid-June, 75 had been called, compared to 34 through the same point a year earlier, more than double. Stephanie White sits on that task force herself, and even she was teed up during the same week. Clark picked up her third technical of the season, after disagreeing with a foul called on Aaliyah Boston. White said afterward that she did not think she deserved the technical but accepted it anyway. The same posture of restraint Clark has been asked to display far more consistently than her peers. The rules changed for everyone this season. The patience extended to players for adjusting to those rules has not changed evenly, and Clark has not been alone in saying so. Angel Reese, Kelsey Plum, and Natasha Cloud have all voiced frustration with officiating at different points this year, and Phoenix guard Sophie Cunningham was fined 3 separate times in a span of months simply for questioning calls in public. The difference is that when those complaints come from Clark, they tend to become the headline rather than one line within it, repeated across multiple outlets and discussed on national programs days after the game itself has ended. The asymmetry becomes even clearer once verbal conduct enters the picture. Not long ago, video circulated of Olivia Miles directing a prolonged animated string of trash talk at Sarah Ashley Barker immediately after a layup, getting in close enough that there was no question who it was aimed at. There was no extended cycle of outrage. If anything, the moment was treated as good theater, replayed approvingly across highlight accounts rather than dissected as a problem. Courtney Williams, asked about it afterward, spoke about loving that competitive energy, framing it as exactly kind of fire the league wants more of. Nobody questioned whether it set a poor example for younger viewers. Nobody suggested it reflected badly on the sport as a whole. Clark, by contrast, has had far smaller moments, a hand gesture, a sustained look toward an opponent treated by analysts as evidence of arrogance or a lack of likability. The same behavior earns a celebratory write-up for one player and a week of scrutiny for another, and the difference has very little to do with the behavior itself. Composure on the bench follows an identical pattern. During the same stretch of physical high-stakes basketball, Cheryl Reeve had to physically hold players back from confronting officials, and players around the league were seen yelling at referees and visibly unraveling over missed calls. None of it generated sustained coverage, and none of it followed those players into the next week's storylines. Around the same window, Breanna Stewart, one of the most respected players in the league, lost her composure with her own coaching staff on the sideline during a game against Indiana. In full view of the broadcast, the response from the media was minimal, treated as an unremarkable byproduct of competitive intensity rather than a referendum on her character. When Clark has shown far less than that, whether arguing a non-call she later admitted she deserved a technical for, or simply reacting in real time to a hit that went unwhistled, the conversation has tended to center on her temperament rather than the conduct itself. Jason Whitlock's response to the Connecticut Sun game captured the dynamic in a single line, telling Clark she needed to grow up in her relationship with officials, a standard rarely applied to veterans who have spent years arguing with the same referees without facing the same characterization. What has been less discussed, but is just as much a part of this season's storyline, is how that same magnified attention has landed on the person responsible for managing Clark on a nightly basis. Stephanie White has coached for more than 2 decades across the WNBA, college basketball, and broadcasting, and her first season back in Indiana produced the franchise's best regular season record in its history, along with a Commissioner's Cup title. None of that has insulated her from a level of scrutiny most coaches in the league simply do not face, because nearly every decision she makes is now evaluated against a single question. Did it help or hurt Caitlin Clark? That scrutiny intensified early in the season, when White substituted Clark Aaliyah Boston, and Lexi Hull out of a game against the expansion Portland Fire with Indiana still holding a lead. The Fever lost that quarter 29-15 and never recovered, falling by 16 points overall. White explained the move afterward as proactive workload management for 2 players she did not want to overextend early in the year, calling the substitution pattern nothing out of the ordinary. A large share of fans saw it differently, framing the moment as the point the game was lost and asking why a healthy in-rhythm Clark was on the bench at all during a winnable stretch. One fan summarized the broader sentiment bluntly, writing that the Fever had been out-coached again, and that it was a miracle the team won anything given what they described as repeated coaching blunders. The criticism resurfaced again in early June, after a tense exchange between Clark and White was caught on camera during a tied game against the Chicago Sky, in the moments before a deciding possession. Fans online accused White of misleading Clark about which play would be run in the final seconds of regulation, with one widely shared comment asking why a head coach would have enough ego to avoid putting the ball in the hands of the best player on her own roster. Clark downplayed any rift afterward, saying those kinds of moments happen all the time over the course of a long season, and the Fever went on to win in overtime behind history-making performances from both Clark and Boston. The clip spread regardless, feeding into a broader fan argument that White's in-game management, not just the noise surrounding the team, has held Indiana back from matching its talent on the roster. That argument gained enough traction that a rumor briefly circulated claiming White had already been let go, attributed to commentator Skip Bayless, who suggested on social media that she would not survive much longer given her friction with Clark during games. Indianapolis Star reporter Chloe Peterson shot the rumor down directly, confirming on the record that White remained the head coach in Indiana, but the fact that the claim spread as far as it did says something about how much weight fans are now placing on every decision White makes. Some of that scrutiny has come from White's own willingness to speak publicly about the same issues affecting her star player. After a loss to the Washington Mystics that came during Clark's absence with a quad injury, White was asked whether the league needed to do more to protect its top players from rough play. Her measured answer called for more consistency in how games are officiated, and within days came reporting that she had been fined for an earlier version of those same comments. A coach with her resume being fined for asking the league to officiate more consistently, in a seasons where fans were already asking the identical question, did little to quiet the argument that the people responsible for protecting Clark are operating under restrictions the rest of the league does not seem to face. There is also a more skeptical reading running through the fan base, separate from any question of league-wide bias, that some of what has gone wrong in Indiana sits with White's own substitution patterns and late-game decision-making rather than outside forces. That sentiment has been pointed enough that some fans have dismissed 2 decades of coaching experience outright, arguing the results on the floor this season do not reflect a coach managing the moment well, and that the same resume being cited as proof of competence is exactly what makes the recent stretch of decisions so hard for them to excuse. Supporters have pushed back on that framing just as forcefully, pointing to the Commissioner's Cup and a franchise-best season, delivered largely without a healthy Clark as evidence the coaching staff knows exactly what it is doing, and noting that White and Clark were working side by side again this summer with USA Basketball during World Cup qualifying, a partnership that produced a perfect record. But the volume and consistency of the criticism, spanning the Portland Fire substitutions, the Chicago Sky sideline exchange, and a firing rumor that needed to be publicly denied, suggests a fan base that has lost patience with explanations and wants to see results align with the talent already on the roster. The same imbalance shows up in how results themselves get framed. When Clark and the Fever struggle, headlines tend to describe a collapse rather than a slump, with one widely circulated piece during her recent foul trouble stretch declaring she had been barely recognizable as a player. When she carries Indiana to a win, as she did against Washington with a fourth-quarter surge that erased a 9-point deficit and forced overtime, the post-game conversation still found room to focus on her coach's reluctance to credit her by name rather than on the performance itself. A loss becomes evidence of a problem large enough to question her coach's job security. A win becomes an outcome that was simply expected, with the attention shifting almost immediately to some smaller irritants surrounding it. Few other players in the league have their bad nights treated as crises, or their best nights treated as routine, in quite the same breath. It is worth acknowledging the other side of this argument, because the discourse around Clark is not uniformly sympathetic. A meaningful portion of fans and analysts argue that some of the attention she receives is a natural consequence of being the face of a rapidly growing league, not evidence of unfair treatment, and that visible frustration with officials, however justified, will always draw more scrutiny for the player with the largest audience watching. Whitlock's repeated commentary reflects that view directly, framing Clark's own conduct toward referees as the root cause of how she is officiated rather than a symptom of the contact she is absorbing. Others within the league have pointed out that complaints about inconsistent officiating are not unique to Clark or Indiana, noting that coaches and players across the WNBA, from Reeve to Hammond to Cunningham, have all clashed publicly with officials this season as the new enforcement standards have been worked out in real time. Those are reasonable points, and they complicate any version of this story that treats Clark purely as a victim of a rigged system. What they do not fully explain is why the same frustration, the same physical toll, and the same coaching decisions produce a dramatically larger and more personal reaction whenever Clark is the one involved. Put all of it together and a clearer picture forms. Clark absorbs more uncalled contact than her peers, then draws public criticism for reacting to it. Other players talk trash, scream at officials, and lose their composure on national broadcasts without lasting consequence, while smaller moments from Clark are treated as character flaws worth a week of debate. Her own coaching staff faces a level of scrutiny, fines, and rumor that no equivalent staff elsewhere in the league is dealing with, because every decision that staff makes is run through the lens of how it affects one player. None of this requires a conspiracy to explain. It requires only the fact that one player now carries the commercial weight of an entire league, and the attention that comes with that weight is applied unevenly to her, to the people coaching her, and to everyone competing against her. Sports talk shows and social media accelerate all of it. A single uncalled foul can be replayed and debated for a full news cycle when Clark is the one on the floor, generating segments on national programs and threads with thousands of replies, while an identical play involving another star is mentioned once and forgotten by the next broadcast. That asymmetry in coverage is not incidental to the double standard, it is part of what sustains it. Every close-up replay of Clark reacting to a no-call adds to a narrative about her temperament, while the absence of equivalent replays for other players means their reactions never accumulate into a storyline at all. The volume of attention shapes the perception of fairness just as much as the officiating itself does. None of this means every grievance raised by Fever fans this season is equally well-founded, or that Stephanie White's substitution patterns and late-game calls are beyond fair criticism on their own merits. Coaching decisions can be questioned without invoking a league-wide conspiracy, and some of what has gone wrong in Indiana this year likely has ordinary basketball explanations rather than hidden motives. But the broader pattern across officiating, conduct, and coverage points to something larger than a handful of unrelated incidents. The season has made that imbalance harder to look past with each passing week, and with half the schedule still to play, there is little indication so far that the pattern is going to correct itself on its own. Whatever happens over the remaining months, the gap between how Clark is treated and how the rest of the league is treated has become one of the defining storylines of the 2026 season, and it is one that fans, coaches, and the league office will keep being asked to explain.